Right now, there's a good chance you've got salt within arm's reach. On your table, in your kitchen cabinet, sitting in some little packet you grabbed from a takeout bag and never opened. You don't think about it. You'll never run out. It costs almost nothing. But for most of human history, that tiny white crystal was worth more than gold, started wars, built roads that still exist today, and collapsed entire empires when it disappeared. And it all started with a problem your body can't solve on its own. Human beings cannot survive without sodium. Your nerves can't fire without it. Your muscles can't contract without it. Your blood can't hold the right volume without it. And here's the catch. Your body has no way to store it long term. You sweat it out, you lose it in urine, and if you don't replace it, you die. Not eventually. Within days. For early humans eating mostly meat, this wasn't really a problem. Meat and blood contain enough sodium to survive on. But somewhere around 10,000 years ago, something changed. Humans started farming, and the diet shifted from meat-heavy to grain-heavy. Grain has almost no sodium in it. So the moment humans became farmers, they accidentally created a biological crisis. They needed a new source of salt, and they needed it constantly. That single problem shaped the next 10,000 years of human civilization more than almost anything else. The earliest evidence of deliberate salt production comes from a site called Poiana Slatinei in Romania, dated to around 6050 BCE. Archaeologists found the remains of briquetage, crude pottery used specifically to boil salt water down into crystallized salt. This wasn't people stumbling onto salt deposits, this was manufacturing. Someone figured out that if you boil brine long enough, you're left with something your entire community needs to stay alive. And once one group figured that out, everyone wanted it. By 6000 BCE in China, along the shores of a lake called Yuncheng in Shanxi province, natural evaporation was already creating salt flats. And archaeological evidence shows people fighting over access to that lake as far back as the legendary battles of the Yellow Emperor. Some historians argue the earliest wars in Chinese history weren't about land or power. They were about who controlled that lake, because whoever controlled the salt controlled everyone who needed it, and everyone needed it. Fast forward to ancient Egypt, and salt wasn't just food seasoning. It was the foundation of an entire industry, mummification. Egyptians used a naturally occurring salt compound called natron, harvested from dry lake beds in the Wadi Natron, to dehydrate bodies during the embalming process. Natron pulled the moisture out of organs and tissue, stopping decomposition in its tracks. Without it, the entire Egyptian afterlife industry, the pyramids, the tombs, the rituals, simply doesn't function. Salt wasn't preserving food in Egypt. It was preserving pharaohs. But it's Rome where salt really shows its power. The word salary comes directly from the Latin word sal, meaning salt. Roman soldiers were sometimes paid partly in salt or given an allowance specifically to buy it. That's where we get the phrase worth his salt. And it wasn't a figure of speech back then. It was literal. If a soldier wasn't performing, he wasn't worth what you were paying him in salt. Rome built entire roads around salt distribution. The Via Salaria, the Salt Road, stretched from the Adriatic coast into the heart of Rome, and its entire purpose was moving salt from coastal saltworks into the city. Sections of that road are still visible today, nearly 2,000 years later, worn into the landscape by carts hauling something you can buy for less than $1 at any grocery store. Roman military expansion followed salt deposits almost like a map. Control a salt works, control the region's food supply. Because without salt, you can't preserve meat, you can't preserve fish, and armies on campaign can't carry fresh food for months at a time. Salted meat and salted fish is what let Roman legions march across entire continents without starving. No salt, no empire. It's that simple. And this is where the story turns, because if controlling salt could build an empire, losing control of it could destroy one. In medieval Europe, salt became one of the most heavily taxed goods in existence. The French monarchy created something called the gabelle, a mandatory salt tax that forced every household above a certain age to buy a minimum quantity of salt at a fixed inflated price, whether they needed it or not. The tax varied wildly by region, which meant smuggling salt across internal French borders became a massive underground economy. People were executed for moving salt without paying the tax. By the 1700s, resentment over the gabelle had built for generations. It wasn't the only cause of the French Revolution, but historians consistently point to it as one of the clearest symbols of everything wrong with the monarchy. A government taxing the one substance every human being biologically requires to survive. When the revolution came, one of the very first things abolished was the gabelle. People didn't just want bread, they wanted the right to season it without paying a king for the privilege. Salt taxes weren't unique to France. Nearly 5,000 miles away, the British Empire ran a similar system in colonial India, and it would end up costing them far more than money. Under British rule, Indians were legally forbidden from producing their own salt, even from seawater sitting right on their own coastline. All salt had to be purchased from the British colonial government, heavily taxed, in a country where salt production had existed independently for thousands of years. In a hot climate where sodium loss through sweat is constant and dangerous, this wasn't just an economic policy. It was control over survival itself. In 1930, Mahatma Gandhi responded by walking 240 miles to the coastal town of Dandi. When he arrived, he picked up a naturally formed lump of salt directly off the beach, an act of deliberate, calculated defiance against colonial law. The Salt March became one of the most powerful acts of civil disobedience in modern history, and it helped ignite the movement that eventually ended British rule in India entirely. Something as small as a crystal of salt helped bring down an empire that spanned a quarter of the globe. And that pattern, salt as leverage, salt as control, salt as the difference between survival and collapse, shows up again and again throughout history. Venice built its entire early economy on salt monopolies, controlling trade routes across the Mediterranean by controlling who could access salt flats. Timbuktu in West Africa became one of the wealthiest trading cities on earth, partly because it sat along routes where slabs of salt were literally traded for their weight in gold, salt moving south from Saharan mines, gold moving north to meet it. There's a reason for that value. Before refrigeration existed, salt was the only reliable way to preserve meat and fish for long journeys or harsh winters. A civilization with a stable salt supply could store food, feed armies, survive famines, and trade across vast distances. A civilization without one was fragile, vulnerable to a single bad harvest, a single hard winter, which means for roughly 9,000 years, from that first briquetage pottery in Romania to the salt taxes that helped topple two of the most powerful governments in history, control over a simple white crystal quietly decided who thrived and who collapsed. Then, in the late 1800s, everything changed. Industrial mining and processing made salt production cheap, fast, and nearly limitless. Deep salt deposits that had been impossible to reach for thousands of years suddenly became accessible at massive scale. And almost overnight, something that had shaped wars, funded governments, and sparked revolutions became one of the cheapest substances on the planet. That's the same salt sitting on your table right now. The next time you sprinkle some on your food without thinking twice, remember what it actually represents. Thousands of years of war, taxation, revolution, and empire all boiled down quite literally into something you can buy in bulk for less than the price of a coffee. It didn't get less important. We just finally solved the problem our ancestors spent 9,000 years fighting over.